Good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Moffitt, for that introduction. I am a historian of the American past. I primarily study American entertainment history and the intersections of American entertainment, particularly African American history, and issues of social justice. My current research project is on the Theater Owners Booking Association, a national circuit of Black-owned and operated theaters that spanned the US in the 1920s. It had headquarter districts in Chicago, Chattanooga, and Washington, D.C. Now, the question that I often get when I explore and discuss my research is, why do I study live theater performance in the 1920s, and why do I study vaudeville, a genre of performance that reached its height of popularity 100 years ago? Well, I study vaudeville as a way to explore the music, dance, and comedy on those stages, but I also use vaudeville and theater performance as a lens to explore the dynamics that were happening in history 100 years ago. Case in point, the headlines in the past couple of months in 2023 have explored rising unionization amongst the actors in Hollywood, racial disparity and culture wars occurring in Florida, and rampant increased discussion about disease. Well, 100 years ago, the headlines talked about rising unionization in the country, racial disparity and culture wars for African Americans in Florida, and a rampant increase in a pandemic and exploration of disease. So the past is not that distant. In fact, often it's not really the past. What I want to do today is to look to see how live theater performance, and specifically TOBA, served as a way of economic empowerment and resistance for the participants in the middle of the 1920s, which was seen as one of the heights of racial violence and a dynamic of tension between Black populations and white populations in the 20th century. TOBA, as a circuit, began as the impetus or the brainchild of a black-faced minstrel performer, S.H. Dudley, who you see at the top corner. He was an African-American actor who performed in blackface for a period of 20 years at the end of the 19th century until he left the blackface behind in the beginning of the 20th century and decided to use theater as a way of expressing and combating social injustice against African-American communities. He relocated from Chicago and opened up a series of theaters in Washington, D.C. in the 1910s. And as early as 1907, he believed that if African Americans could actually own the buildings that they performed in, they would have a greater sense of autonomy on stage in the same time period that there was a rising sense of white supremacist violence. Now, his thought about having a Black-owned circuit in the 1910s expanded by the 1920s, and he was joined by white professionals and entrepreneurs, namely Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs, alongside other African Americans to create and charter the institution known as TOBA. Now, in my discussion of the founders of the organization, the resistance element always exists for me when I explore that this is an organization that had women in the leadership at the forefront, African American women, represented here in this photo by the Griffin sisters, Emma and Mabel, who were vaudeville performers from the 1890s on, and by 1910, they moved to Chicago and decided to follow in Dudley's footsteps and own and operate their own theaters. They believed in a sense of Black autonomy on the theater stage, but they also believed in gender equality. And this is before we get to something like the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. What I want to spend the remainder of my time with you discussing this afternoon are the performers, the artists on the TOBA stage. And out of the over 400 different acts, from comedians to dancers to singers to musicians, I picked just a few, some of them who might have a little local connection. I want to explore how the performers themselves actually use the circuit as various ways of economic empowerment, and thus and still looking at economic empowerment as resistance in the middle of segregation. So the top duo that you see here above me, Butterbeans and Susie. a famous comedic duo whose comic stylings kind of represent what you would see later on in the 20th century, evidenced by Sanford and Son, with Aunt Wanda and a Fred Sanford character. They were a married couple, Susie and Josie Edwards, and they took the money and income that they made from headlining all over the circuit, again, 100 different theaters, to open their own cosmetic and hair supply company, of all things, in New York in the 1920s. They had the Race Supply Company. And so they built a trust from being these performers on stage in which African Americans saw themselves reflected in their acts. But they also built a trust with consumers by selling products that actually appeal to African American users. Troupers also used the circuit as a way of arts education. So in the absence of having a professional music school or music training, you had singers, musicians, using the circuit as a training ground. And so the dapper man that you see above me in the cap and the cigarette was actually Thomas Dorsey. Now, Thomas Dorsey was a famous composer and pianist, and by the 1930s, he's considered to be the father of gospel music. He is the composer of the famous gospel song, Precious Lord. But in the 1920s, Mr. Dorsey was Georgia Tom, and he was a pianist for Ma Rainey, the country blues musician. Now, he learned various elements of composition, music theory, but also how to perform, how to create a community with other artists that transcended the sacred and the secular. Baltimore natives, right behind me or below me, depending on where you are, Cab Calloway and Blanche Calloway found themselves as Toba stars, and much to the chagrin of their parents, African American community here in Baltimore, who wanted them to be doctors and lawyers, found themselves being the parents of a blues singer and an international swing star. Now, the circuit itself had many obstacles. One being that fame and fortune was one that was only really given to the headliners. Your average performer made $15 a week and had to pay for housing, lodging, all of that out of the $15. So what performers did to resist that type of situation was they formed their own union. In 1924, they formed the Colors Actor Union in Washington, D.C. The other obstacles that mounted for Toba troopers were the very existence of segregation. Travel was difficult. The main form of transportation between these 100 theaters was the railroad, and the railroad was inherently segregated. African American passengers would pay the same fee as white passengers, but they would be forced to ride in the colored car. In order to kind of circumvent some of these problems, headliners like Bessie Smith or Ma Rainey would own and operate their own cars within the Southern Railroad or the B&O, for example. So they would not have to withstand some of this humiliation of segregation. Another obstacle that loomed over the troopers during the circuit was that of violence. The Dreamland Theater was one of the first theaters on the circuit in 1921, and it was leveled during the Tulsa Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in May of 1921. The resistance operation here with violence was the fact that the theater, was owned by a Mrs. Luella Williams, again, another African-American woman, rebuilt itself, and then she went on to buy 3 other theaters in Oklahoma. The circuit was one that brought communities together. Troopers had to find places to dress, to eat, and African-American businesses were open to support the circuit and vice versa. You have Black-owned hotels, boarding houses, restaurants, things like seamstresses who only catered to the costumes needed for the circuit. Even trucking transportation companies that would move scenery around from place to place. All of this had to be duplicated in a segregated society. The circuit itself, its success, was a testament to Black excellence in terms of business, Black artistic skill, and a momentary period of interracial cooperation. It was truly an example of Jazz Age resistance. Thank you.